Welcome to Matters Financial and Geopolitical from a Frontier. Thank you for stopping by. I took this photograph in the morning. It was some sort of cloud formation which caught the sun, I think, and I tweeted "Good morning, world," and it put me in a rather good mood, I must admit. If you haven't, and I don't think we've spoken about it, but we've now edited just the speech. We're putting up the Q&A in a moment of Mind Speak with Ambassador Robert Godek, who was a great guest. He really was, and very articulate, sophisticated, and sort of subtle kind of diplomat, not one to bang his drum. Macro thoughts, two, and if not three, but the two I'm speaking about are the most powerful women in the world, take to the stage today: Janet Yellen and Christine Lagarde, and I'm sure that will be interesting to hear what both have got to say. And another interesting macro point is FT research shows that on the days of the 9 press conferences held since the start of 2013 by Ms. Yellen and her predecessor Ben Bernanke, the dollar index, measuring the greenback against a basket of its peers, has shifted on average more than twice as much as it does on other days, which is evident given the types of moves we've seen recently. Home thoughts, I was thinking of my mother. It would have been her birthday yesterday, and she would have so enjoyed the company of her grandchildren, in particular Hannah, who's Miss Chatterbox, I must admit, and had a lovely time at Finch Hattons. I'll put up a photograph of her sitting in a rather grand chair, and I'll put up another photograph of the sunset from the Chyulu Hills. We were up in the Chyulu Hills. They have this wonderful position where you have a picnic and a sundowner, and you see the Kilimanjaro in the foreground, but it's very light. It's like a watercolor, so it doesn't show in a photograph. But I took this photograph of the sunset. The Chyulu Hills are located about 150 kilometers east of the Kenya Rift. The hills consist of several hundred small flows and cones. Volcanism in the area started about 1.4 million years ago in the northern parts of the hills, and over time the volcanism propagated towards the southeast. These volcanoes are still considered active since their last two eruptions, Shetani and Chyulu. And Shetani is this amazing place in Savo West where the lava obviously flowed down and then, froze, as it were. Within the hills is the Leviathan Cave, one of the longest lava tubes in the world. And, it really is beautiful. Does not have any permanent rivers, but rainfall on hills feeds the Sava and Galana rivers and Mazima Springs on the surrounding plains. Chyulu Hills divides the Savo and Amboseli plains. Political reflections: Greek Prime Minister accused the fund, that's the IMF, and that makes Ms. Lagarde's comments even more interesting today, accused the fund of criminal responsibility for the situation, said lenders were seeking to humiliate his country. Speaking to Germany's Spiegel newspaper, Varoufakis said the proposals for spending cuts and reforms were already so harsh and brutal the Germans themselves would never accept them. He said Greece will only commit to them if Europe agrees to a debt restructuring, investments, and an end to the liquidity crisis. Asked if an agreement could be reached this weekend, he said, "Ask Merkel." Put up a photograph of Tsipras with MPs of the Greek Parliament in Athens. The photograph is captioned "Last Chance Salute." 3 years ago today, Saudi Arabian police arrested Raif Badawi for the crime of running a website that propagates liberal thought. His blog had put the case for secularism in observations such as this: states which are based on religion confine their people in the circle of faith and fear. As if to prove his point, a Sharia court hauled Badawi back into the fearful circle, sentencing him to 600 lashes and 7 years in jail for going beyond the realm of obedience. Last year, deciding that he had been let off too lightly, a judge upped the punishment to 1,000 lashes and 10 years imprisonment, plus a fine. And then, of course, we learned the AFP news agency reports that there have now been 100 beheadings in Saudi Arabia since the start of 2015, far exceeding last year's tally and putting it on course for a new record. It's almost as if the House of Saud is showing off to ISIS, the new kid on the block, publicly beheading apostates. Pa! We were doing that when you were in nappies. Amnesty of Portugal tweeted this image: blogging is not a crime. I think it translates as: world hasn't had so many refugees since 1945. About 1% of the global population, or about 73 million people, have been forced to leave their homes amid a spike in armed conflict over the past 4 years, the Institute for Economics and Peace, which compiles the Global Peace Index, said in a report published on Wednesday. 1 in every 130 people on the planet is currently a refugee or displaced, and most of that comes out of conflicts in the Middle East. The numbers in Syria, where as many as 13 million of its 22 million people are displaced, are staggering. The number of people killed in conflict rose to 180,000 in 2014 from 49,000 in 2010. Of that number, deaths from terrorism increased by 9% to an estimated 20,000. The impact of this violence on the global economy, including the cost of waging war, homicides, internal security services, and violent and sexual crimes, reached $14.3 trillion in the past year. To put it into perspective, it's 13.4% of global GDP, equivalent to the combined economies of Brazil, Canada, France, Germany, Spain, and the UK. It's also more than 6 times the value of Greece's bailout and loans from the IMF, ECB, and other Eurozone countries combined. Iceland tops the index as the most peaceful country in the world, Syria as the least. And there's a PDF report if you want to have a look. And essentially saying the world is becoming increasingly divided, with some countries enjoying unprecedented levels of peace and prosperity, while others spiral further into violence and conflict. And I think it goes back to that phrase I kept using, which was the arrhythmia, which I think sort of puts it best. It's a very arrhythmic world we live in, with irregular heartbeat. Africa is now the world's least peaceful region for the first time since the index began. Globally, the intensity of internal armed conflict has increased dramatically, with the number of people killed in conflicts rising over 3.5 times, from 49,000 in 2010 to 180,000 in 2014. So some folks got lucky, others did not. I like this photograph that The Guardian put up, apparently talking about demand for the Shah of Iran's memorabilia, and the Shah and Queen Farah Diba in 1960, of course. He then divorced her and married again. And they said that his second wife was obviously the real love of his life. But it's interesting, that whole story. And still, I take you back to that book by Kapuscinski, which I consider the best book about, although he's been criticized for reportage, which means that I think at times he played liberal with the facts, but the overall picture I think is pretty exact in my view. Eric Scott Huntsader, a very interesting fellow, I like following him on Twitter. Fascinating. Most of bull market gains have come overnight. Here's each 30-minute interval in the S&P. It's an interesting point. Basically, it's squeezed higher overnight. If you could run those trades, you'd probably outperform that index by a wide margin. His best deal, Kerkorian said, and he's passed away, was buying the land that today houses Caesar's Palace in the Las Vegas Strip for a mere $800,000. Currency markets, the euro when I came in was at 112.50, we're now at 112.76. Dollar index this morning was at 94.925. Japanese yen is trading at 123.66. The Swissy this morning was at 0.9312, but I think there's been a move in the Swissy because they've adjusted the repo rate, but I haven't had a chance to look. The pound is at 156.46. The Aussie has a very bad session, now trading 0.7692, and iron ore was down big overnight, dragging the New Zealand dollar down as well, below 69.50. India rupee 64.125, the South African rand to 12.39, but I reckon that's blown out a bit by now. Dollar index, let me put up a 3-month chart. I still remain bullish, and I think what we're seeing in the high yielding currencies, a lot of weakness in the New Zealand dollar, Canadian, Aussie, is signaling that there's another bout of dollar strength on its way. Euro dollar, I'll put up a 1-month chart. This can go higher, but I don't think the fundamental story has changed. Holger Scheipitz shows that German bunds opened higher, 10-year yields nudged down to 0.797, but that's probably on peripheral bond selling, which is creating demand for the safe haven bond against which they've probably been trading it. And then Hanseder again, and this is an interesting signal for the stock market. Option activity set a new record yesterday. This record was built from 7.1 trillion records. Crude oil, when I checked, was at $60.50, and how it stayed here is a miracle, I don't know. Gold, 1179 when I looked earlier today. I remain bearish. Coming to sub-Saharan Africa, lots of interesting things to talk about here. Let's start off with this quote I came across. Whoever did not know about the myth of the African lion leaping forward towards a democratic future spurred on by double-digit economic growth now knows it is just that, a fairy tale. And then this is an article in Deutsche Welle. The incident in Johannesburg carries a devastating message. South Africa and Nigeria, both Africa's political and economic heavyweights, have openly gone against the International Criminal Court, whose chief prosecutor, by the way, is an African, which makes it hard to believe she is pursuing a neo-colonialist witch hunt against African leaders, a narrative the African dictators like to peddle. This is a photograph I'm going to put up that I found on Al Jazeera, but I think it's an AFP photograph of President Omar al-Bashir arriving in Khartoum from Johannesburg. Another interesting piece was in Reuters. In Bashir fiasco, Pretoria makes clear Africa comes first. The decision confirmed by the departure of Bashir's plane into the skies above the capital on Monday spoke volumes about South Africa's priorities. Africa comes first, and legal niceties such as the authority of domestic courts or international statutes a distant second. It was a dramatic volte-face from 2009, when shortly after Bashir's indictment by the International Criminal Court for war crimes and crimes against humanity in Darfur, his South African counterpart Jacob Zuma made clear he was not welcome. Appearing on CNN, Zuma was asked if he would order Bashir's arrest should he ever set foot inside your country. That is correct, he replied, confirming lingering remnants of the idealism that underpinned South Africa's relations with the outside world in the early days of the Rainbow Nation under Nelson Mandela. 6 years later, the Bashir episode has highlighted two dominant themes under Zuma: a nation with a split European-African personality for the last 3 centuries now sees its destiny firmly in Africa, and with growing South African trade and investment in the rest of the continent, the idealism is dead. That was in Reuters. Zimbabwe seeks $300 million to buy maize, avert starvation after another poor harvest, and therefore calling upon all our partners to assist us to ensure that none of the communities nationwide is exposed to hunger and starvation. Approximately $300 million is required to import food to cover the deficit and see us through the next harvest, hoping that it will be significantly better than the current one. While we need 1.4 million tons of maize a year for consumption, our produce for the 2014-2015 season has gone down by approximately 49%. It's a big drop. South African all shares up 3.068% so far this year. Dollar rand, as I said last, 12.39.31. Egyptian court has sentenced the deposed President Mohamed Morsi to death on Tuesday on charges of killing, kidnapping and other offences during a 2011 mass jail breakout. The General Guide of the Muslim Brotherhood, Muhammad Badi, and 4 other Brotherhood leaders were also hanged the death penalty. More than 80 others were sentenced to death in absentia. Put up a photograph of Mohamed Morsi. It's a little bit crazy, surreal. I don't understand why you've got to put the man in jail. Egyptian stock market is down 4.145% this year. Nigerian all shares down 3.044%. Pretty much all turned negative except for South Africa, Tanzania. The cedi has dropped 26% this year, which is a huge drop, isn't it, when you think about it. Ghana Stock Exchange is up a measly 4.37% in 2015. The Uganda Central Bank raised its key lending rate to 13% from 12%. Finch is concerned over Kenya and Uganda's aggressive borrowing. This is a report I read in the Business Daily. Kenya and Uganda's financial year 2016 budgets push fiscal consolidation further out into the future, risking an increase in debt, which, if sustained, could undermine their sovereign ratings. Rwanda's budget foresees faster consolidation, but medium-term fiscal targets may prove challenging as direct budget support from foreign donors falls. And I wrote about this over the weekend when I said, last year you just had to put up your hand and the markets asked, how much would you like, Mr. Rotich, $1 billion or $2 billion? I'm not sure that golden flood of liquidity is as reliable this year as it was last year. Katrina's written about Nestle, which is cutting its Africa workforce by 15% across 21 African countries because it's saying it overestimated the rise of the middle class. We thought this would be the next Asia, but we have realized the middle class here in the region is extremely small. It's not really growing. This is Cornel Krumenaka. I do some work for him actually. It's quite a bearish interview, but I think they took some early bets which did not come off. And he just saw a very, very expensive footprint and really no headline revenue to justify it. Closed its offices in Rwanda and Uganda entirely, reducing its product line by half. Might close some of its 15 warehouses before September. A survey from the African Development Bank put the continent's middle class at 330 million in 2011, but a survey from Standard Bank last year, highlighted by Mr. Krumenaka during the interview, puts it at a more sobering 15 million across 11 countries, with only 800,000 middle-class households in Kenya, a nation of 44 million people. I said I think Nestle bet big, and that was pre his arrival, and it didn't come through. Didn't have the right products for the market, and the growth of the middle class is not as fast-paced as it might have been. Some multinationals expected a steeper trajectory. So do have a look at that article. Old Mutual has got the nod to purchase a major stake in UAP. The group Tuesday said it received all regulatory approvals to buy the stakes of three firms, Abraj Group, Africa Invest and Sweat Fund, who had a combined shareholding of 37.3% in UAP Holdings. And they also got 23.3% of the company prior to that. They'll hold a majority of 60.7%. Kenya Airways has rebounded pretty strongly of late, up 13.333% since Friday. Williamson Tea has surged 38.46% over 2 sessions. That was on that special dividend I spoke about before. Kenya shilling 97.496 last time I took a look. Nairobi all share marginally minus 0.006% year to date. NSE 20 is down 6.63% year to date. But bear in mind, the stock market appreciated the repeal of the capital gains tax on Friday and has been building a little bit more positively since that time. Once again, thank you for stopping by.